Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village is located on 20900 Oakwood Boulevard in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it is open if you check the web for more information about that. The Henry Ford Museum is a building that is part of the much larger Edison Institute, which also includes Greenfield Village. Also, the Henry Ford Museum opened in 1929, and also he dedicated the institution to his friend Thomas Edison, and celebrated with a grand opening known as Light's Golden Jubilee in honor of the 50th anniversary of his invention of the electric light. Also, it is the world's premier history destination that celebrates 300 years of American history and innovation. The museum has an eclectic collection of antique machinery, automobiles, trains, aircrafts, and famous homes, including John F. Kennedy's presidential limousine, Abraham Lincoln's chair from Ford's Theater, where he was assassinated in 1865, Thomas Edison's laboratory, and the Wright brothers' bicycle shop, which was moved there from Dayton, Ohio, and as well as that, it has the bus that Rosa Parks was on when she refused to give up her seat. And a lot of history you may have learned about that before in your life. The Wright brothers' home and cycle shop and Buckminster Fuller's Demaction House is also included. The village was founded in 1929 as an educational and historic landmark, maintaining the buildings and stories of America's past for future generations. Greenfield Village is where you journey into America's past to discover inspiration for bringing innovation and imagination into your life today. Also, it has 240 acres of land, of which only 90 acres are used for the attraction, the rest being forest, river, and extra pasture for the sheep and horses. It features some old buildings such as Thomas Edison's Menlo Park Laboratory and Complex, working farms, a carriage barn, cider mill, Liberty Craftworks, Armington and Sims Machine Shop, Davidson Gerson Gallery of Glass, Henry Ford's Model T, Bagley Avenue Workshop, Wright Cycle Shop, Edison at Work, and a lot you'll find there. And also, it has railroad-related structures like a roundhouse from the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Railroad, and the Smiths Creek Depot from the Grand Trunk Western Railroad, and etc. Also, as well as that, there are rides and other attractions there like pull glass with world-class artisans, 1867 baseball, and as well as that, the village has an operating railroad called the Weiser Railroad with old-time steam trains that goes around the village. The railroad was started in 1970, and some staff members thought the village would look great with a railroad going around. And the first train ride was given on the 22nd of August in 1972. The first train ride was given at the village. And also, it features 3 station stops, which is the Smiths Creek Station, which the loading platform is just east of the structure, Firestone and Susquehanna, and the train takes you around the village. The village even inspired Walt Disney with the idea of building an amusement park in Southern California known as Disneyland, and he even had a love of trains too.
What you see right behind me is the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Roundhouse.
The Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Marshall Roundhouse was built in 1884 in Marshall, Michigan, and is a former Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee roundhouse. This roundhouse was originally in Marshall, Michigan, and used for the steam engines and where that work took place, and would service steam engines inside. Then later on, it got relocated to this spot in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and it is used for servicing the locomotives and equipment of Greenfield Village's railroad. And also, you can even walk inside, and there is a balcony where you can view the shop from, and also you'll find a lot of interesting stuff inside as well. And also, the steam engines are even in here whenever they're not running, as it's where they rest for the night or just sit whenever they're not being used, like when they're going under some work while not running or just sitting cold as well.
What you see right behind me is the turntable.
This turntable was built by Detroit Bridge and Iron Works in Detroit, Michigan in 1901, and also it is an Armstrong turntable. It was originally used for the Pere Marquette Railroad in Petoskey, Michigan. Also, this turntable is pushed around by human beings like myself, and people turn a rail car and locomotive on it as well. Then later it was moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and the well for it was built in front of the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Roundhouse as well. It is also used to rotate the train cars and locomotives from one track to another as well. Detroit and Lima Northern 7 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1897, and is the 153 17th steam locomotive built by that factory, and is a 440 American type steam locomotive. This locomotive was originally used for the Detroit and Lima Northern Railroad, and this is its original number. Later, then in 1901, it was consolidated for the Detroit Southern Railroad and kept the number. Then a corp sale in 1905 to the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railway and still kept the number. Then in 1914, a corp sale to the same railroad, which changed to Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad and still numbered 7. Also, this locomotive was then transferred to Henry Ford in 1921 and was his personal locomotive, which was his favorite locomotive. Henry Ford was also the owner of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad as well. In 1930, it was donated to the Edison Institute, and also came to be part of Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. Then in 2012, it was restored to operation and once again operated under its own power, and also it can often be seen hauling the train around Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan these days as well. Also, Detroit and Lima Northern 7 is one of 2 440s that once served the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, and 16 is at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and Detroit and Lima Northern 7 can be found here at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and sometimes seen hauling the train around the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is the Grand Trunk Western Smiths Creek Depot.
The Grand Trunk Western Smiths Creek Station was built in 1859 and was originally located in Smiths Creek, Michigan, and was used for the Grand Trunk Western Railway. Thomas Edison would walk on board a Grand Trunk train and walk around the train selling newspapers and candy to the passengers. While riding one such train in 1863, Thomas Edison accidentally set the baggage car on fire while he was conducting a chemical experiment using phosphorus. When the fire was put out, an angry conductor of the Grand Trunk train threw Thomas Edison off the train at the Smiths Creek station. As Thomas Edison told Henry Ford the story, Henry Ford decided to go find the Smiths Creek station. Then he found it and purchased it from the Grand Trunk Western Railway, and then he had the depot moved from Smiths Creek, Michigan to Dearborn, Michigan. And also, it is seen here at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. And also, the platform where train boarding is just east of the structure as well.
Alright, you can see right here two cars that run on the tracks here at the Greenfield Village, where passengers ride on them to take a trip around the village. There are 5 more cars here as well. So let's look at the others. Okay, and here are 2 more cars that are rideable, but looks like they are getting a little bit of work done on them at the moment. And these cars have been part of Greenfield Village for a number of years, and probably since the opening. And there are 3 more cars, and let's go look at the other 3, shall we? The rideable cars, they are Dearborn, Michigan. They're all set. They are video. What you see right behind me is Detroit and Mackinac W52.
Detroit and Mackinac W52 was built somewhere in the 1910s and is a wooden caboose. This caboose's original number is unknown, and was used for the Detroit and Mackinac Railroad for a number of years. It was even used as the train crew's office and was at the back of freight trains as well. Later, it was likely put into maintenance of way service and received this number. Then it was retired and was then acquired by Greenfield Village, and there are times it is often seen rolling on the tracks at the village as well.
What you see right behind me is Hunters Point and Erie Basin 1.
Hunters Point and Erie Basin 1 was built by the J.M. Jones and Company in West Troy, New York in 1875 and is a horse-drawn car. This car was operated by the Brooklyn City Railroad on the line between Hunters Point, Long Island City, and Erie Basin in South Brooklyn, and this car would also be pulled by one horse and used in the state of New York. Also, it would carry 16 passengers on board at a time. Then later on, this car was then retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and it was a gift from the Brooklyn City Railroad Company as well. And it can also be seen right in this spot, just in the automobile display area in the museum as well, for all to see and enjoy. The New York Central DeWitt Clinton was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893, and the locomotive has an 040 wheel arrangement, and this is the replica of the DeWitt Clinton. The original locomotive was built in 1831 and was designed by John B. Jervis and built by David Matthew at the West Point Foundry for the Mohawk Hudson in 1831. and operated on the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, a New York Central predecessor. It was the Mohawk and Hudson's first locomotive, the first to operate in the state of New York, and only the fourth steam locomotive built in the U.S., shipped to Albany by riverboat. It made its debut at a celebration to mark the opening of steam operations on the line. Until then, trains had been pulled on the 16-mile line from Albany to Schenectady, New York by horses. The replica DeWitt Clinton traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s. This replica of the DeWitt Clinton was built for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Named after the U.S. Senator and the 6th Governor of New York, who was largely responsible for construction of the Erie Canal, the original locomotive apparently weighed some 6,750 pounds, had 54-inch drivers and 5.5-inch by 16-inch cylinders. It appeared at the 1927 fair of the Iron Horse in Maryland and was used for promotional purposes by the New York Central Railroad until loaned to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan in 1935. It appeared at the 1933 to 1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, the DeWitt Clinton can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today. It is displayed much as it would have appeared at its inauguration in 1831, pulling a car carrying water barrels and 3 passenger carriages made of stagecoach bodies attached to the railroad trucks. These were standard passenger conveyances of the day, although soon superseded by purpose-built passenger carriages. Today, it is on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, in the train display section of the museum as well.
You see right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 1.
Mohawk and Hudson 1 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other 2 cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the 2 other cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the 2 other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton locomotive, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today in the train display area in the museum.
Right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 2.
Mohawk and Hudson 2 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other two cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the two other cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the two other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton locomotive, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display in the train display area in the museum.
What you see right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 3.
Mohawk and Hudson 3 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other two cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the two cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the two other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today in the train display area in the museum.
What you see right behind me is the Stephenson Rocket.
This is a replica of the Stephenson Rocket that was built by Robert Stephenson and Company in Darlington, England in 1931. The original was built by the company in 1829. Also, the Stephenson Rocket is an 022 type steam locomotive and is the 4072nd steam locomotive built in the factory. Also, the locomotive is named Rocket as well. The original Rocket won Stephenson 500 pounds at the Rainhill Trials, a competition set up by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway to determine the best motive power to employ on the railroad. 10 locomotives were entered, but only 5 competed. The Rocket was the only one to compete the 3-day trials starting on the 6th of October 1829, over which it averaged 12 miles per hour and achieved a top speed of 30 miles per hour. Stephenson was consequently awarded the contract to build locomotives for the Liverpool and Manchester. Also, there are basically 3 replica rockets that are still around today, and there are 2 that can be found in the United States, including the one here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and there is also one at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. Also, there are 2 more over in England, and there is also only one that operates for all to enjoy and see. Also, this replica of the rocket came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here in the train exhibit area in the building, and seen here on display as well.
Right behind me is Atlantic and Gulf
3. Atlantic and Gulf 3 was built by Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey in 1858 and is the A12th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 440 American type steam locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Sam Hill. It was originally used for the Atlantic and Gulf to work at one of its logging plants, and this is the original number. This locomotive was one of the first locomotives bought by the railroad and was named Satilla, after the river of that name. Chartered in 1856, the Atlantic and Gulf crossed southern Georgia from Thomasville to Screven, where it connected with the Savannah, Albany, and Gulf Railroad onto Savannah. The two railroads that were consolidated in 1863. The locomotive was sold to the Savannah, Florida and Western Railway in 1879 and kept the number. Then, in 1889, was sold to the J.J. McDonough Lumber Company and was renumbered 110. This locomotive worked at McDonough's for 35 years until it was purchased by Henry Ford in 1924. Henry Ford then renamed the locomotive Sam Hill in honor of an engineer who had worked on a Michigan Central Express that passed through Dearborn, Michigan, when he was a boy. Henry Ford loaned the locomotive to appear at the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse in Maryland. Then he donated it to the Edison Institute in 1928, where it was renamed the President in honors of President Herbert Hoover when it was chosen to haul a set of specially built cars to the opening of the Institute. Also, the locomotive was put in the museum hall with the train display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen on display where it can be seen today.
right behind me is Bangor and Aroostook 6.
Bangor and Aroostook 6 was built sometime between 1925 and 1928 and is a passenger coach. But it was built to replicate a Bangor and Aroostook coach from the 1855 to 1865 era. This car is a replica of an old-style passenger coach from the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad when passengers would ride aboard it as well, and was used in the state of Maine. As well as that, it is a recreation of a Civil War-era Bangor and Aroostook day car. Then later on, this car was added to the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and can be seen on display in the train display area in the museum where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake and Ohio 1601.
Chesapeake and Ohio 1601 was built by Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio in 1941 and is the 7821st steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 2666 Alleghany type steam locomotive and is an H8 class steam locomotive. This locomotive worked its life on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and also it was one of the first 10 Alleghanies built and numbered from 1600 to 1609, and it is one of the first 60-built Alleghany locomotives. The locomotive was designed to work over the Alleghany Mountains on Chesapeake and Ohio's Clifton Forge Division, and that's how these locomotives got the name Alleghany. These locomotives usually doubled on the most challenging part of the grade, on one at the front and one at the back, typically pulling 100-car coal trains eastbound from Hinton, West Virginia to the top of the grade at Alleghany. Then it was retired like in 1956 and was donated to the Edison Institution, and also it was brought to the museum on the rear of a Chesapeake and Ohio freight train, and it took 3 attempts to get the locomotive into the museum since it's the largest piece in the collection. First attempt, it derailed on the railroad tracks behind the museum. After removing its main and side rods, it was time for a second attempt. The locomotive made it as far as the museum's railroad doors, but was unable to pass through, even though the door had been widened to accommodate it. The problem was the switch inside the building. As the locomotive started to pass over the switch, its articulation caused the cab to swing over much further than anticipated. On the third attempt, following temporary modifications and component removals, the locomotive finally passed through the door, and it took its place in the museum and sat in its final resting spot. Today, it is part of the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well. Also, Chesapeake and Ohio 1601 is one of 2 surviving 2666 Alleghany type steam locomotives left in the world today, and 1604 is the other one, and is on display at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and 1601 can be found here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also you can even visit the locomotive's cab and even sit where the engineer and fireman used to sit as well.
What you see right behind us, Fruit Growers Express 55667.
Fruit Growers Express 55667 was built by Fruit Growers Express Company in Alexandria, Virginia in 1924 and is a wooden refrigerator car. This car was once used on the Fruit Growers Express train many years ago, and it appears it was used on a line of refrigerator cars like it, and it would also carry what refrigerator cars would carry, like fruit on board and whatever else it might have hauled in the past as well. Then later on, this car was retired and came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well. Cleveland Railway Company 0140 was built by the Brill Car Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1892 and is a Brill streetcar. This streetcar was originally used for the Cleveland Electric Railway and originally numbered 165, and it was used for like hauling people on board when being used for the Cleveland Electric Railway Company. Then in 1910, it was then used for the Cleveland Railway Company and kept the number. Then in 1916, the number was changed to 0140. Then in 1942, it was then used on the Cleveland Transit System and kept the number, and this car was used most of its life in Cleveland, Ohio. Then later on it was retired and in 1954 came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan and seen on display in the train exhibit area in the building as well.
You see right behind these Fort Collins Municipal Railway 26.
Fort Collins Municipal Railway 26 was built by American Car Company in St. Louis, Missouri in 1922 and is a Birney trolley car. This car was originally used for the Cheyenne Electric Railway and was originally numbered 7. This car was originally used for Cheyenne, Wyoming, then in 1924 was purchased by the Fort Collins Municipal Railway. It was also used for the Fort Collins Municipal Railway with sister trolleys on that trolley line in Fort Collins, Colorado, and would also carry people on board in the neighborhood of Fort Collins. Then in 1951 it was then retired from service and then later it was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it sits right in this spot in the train display area in the museum as well for all to see and enjoy.
What you see right behind these Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 77.
Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 77 was built by the Standard Steel Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1925 and is a wooden caboose. This caboose was once used for the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad many years ago as the train crew's office and would be used behind freight trains for the railroad as well. Then later on, the car was retired and came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well.
What you see right behind these Detroit and Mackinac 100.
Detroit and Mackinac 100 was built by the Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio sometime between 1901 and 1905 and is a combination car of a baggage car and a passenger car. This car was used on passenger trains in the state of Michigan on the Detroit and Mackinac Railroad, and also it has 3 compartments, one for passengers riding on board with 7 seats, and the other is where baggage would be put inside, and also another is a smoking compartment. Then later on the car was retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen on display in the train exhibit area in the building as well.
What you see right behind me is Canadian Pacific 400,850.
Canadian Pacific 400,850 was built by the Canadian Pacific's Angus shops in Montreal, Canada in the 1920s and is a wedge snowplow. This snowplow was used for the Canadian Pacific's maintenance of way, and also whenever it was used to clear snow off the tracks, it would take 2 locomotives to push it and to have it push snow off the tracks of the Canadian Pacific Railroad as well. Then later on, This snowplow was retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is on display today in the train exhibit area in the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Bessemer and Lake Erie 154.
Bessemer and Lake Erie 154 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1909 and is the 333/70th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive and is a C3B class steam locomotive. This locomotive was used for being a freight locomotive when being used on the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, as it would be used for hauling heavy loads of iron ore on the railroad. Then, in 1953, it was retired and in October 1983 was sold to the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. Then, later that same month, it was then transferred to the Edison Institution and then moved to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and the Illinois Railway Museum traded it for Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 16, which is a 440 American-type steam locomotive, and this locomotive can be seen right here in this spot in the train display where it can be seen today. Also, Bessemer and Lake Erie 154 is the only surviving Bessemer and Lake Erie 280 left in the world today and can be seen here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Ingersoll-Rand 90.
Ingersoll-Rand 90 was built by Alco, General Electric, and Ingersoll-Rand in Phillipsburg, New Jersey in 1926, and the builder's number for Alco is 66752, and General Electric is 10132, and is a 60-ton box cab type diesel locomotive and is a GE Class BB 120-120-0 4HM 840-840G. This locomotive was one of the first successful diesel-powered locomotives ever built. It was used as a promotional demonstrator switching in Ingersoll-Rand's Phillipsburg works in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, and moving freight cars around as well. Then later on it was retired in the late 1960s, and in 1970 it was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Then it went on display in 1984 and is seen here on display in the building with the train display as well.
Okay, you can see right behind me, this is a model of the Alleghany behind me. This is it. Looks like probably Lionel model, I think. And also there are buttons right here. This is the 1601 and the real 1601 is behind me. So here's the button to whistle and button to bell. And that's how it's done. What you see right behind me is the Pullman Fairlane.
The Pullman Fairlane was built by Pullman in 1921 and is an observation lounge car. Henry and Claire Ford found it increasingly difficult to travel with any degree of privacy. They purchased a private rail car and named it Fairlane. Also, Henry Ford made an arrangement with the Pullman Company to build this specifically designed railroad car for his long-distance travel needs. The car has a spacious sleeping quarter for 8 people, an elegant dining room, a fully supplied kitchen, and it even has an observation lounge area. Also, the interior was designed by Sidney Houghton of London, England. Henry and Claire Ford made over 400 trips using Fairlane before selling the car in 1942. It was sold to the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad that year, and it gained the number 5 for that railroad. Also, the car has a number which is 800,019 as well, which it had that number for service as a private car on Amtrak. Then later, it was retired and was then acquired by the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is today. In 2020, it was moved out of the building and briefly rolled on the Greenfield Village tracks. Then in 2022, it was moved back into the museum building. Today, it can be found on display in the train exhibit area in the building as well. Okay, I'm going to show you all the Lionel model railroad they have on display here. I'll get behind the camera and show you all around, so here we go. Okay, so here I go showing you the model railroad display they have here. There's Thomas going on a section of rails. Those look like old style Lionel tracks. Look at how well detailed that is. That looks like Slink from Toy Story, and that's the model of the Alleghany, and the real one is right there. The real 1601. That one has the same number. Look at how cool and elevated this track is. Isn't it well detailed or what? Pretty cool how they put this together. Yeah, I like how they have this all displayed here. Okay, you could see in these two cases right here, that looks like a model of a 440 from the Pennsylvania Railroad. And let's see what it is. It's an 1860 era, and in this case, this is a multiple unit Lackawanna passenger car, and also these are two of them, plural actually. And those twin, and behind it, on the other side of it, is the model of the President Washington. And it's 5300. The real one can be, or the original one, I don't know if this is live stream, but this model, the 4501, the prototype, is actually at the Baltimore and Ohio Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. What you see right behind me is Norfolk and Western 25802. Norfolk and Western 28502 was likely built in 1966 and is a hopper car. This car spent many years being used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars and hauled many different types of cargo such as rocks, coal, gravel, rubble, and many different types of cargo may have hauled many years ago. Then in 1982, the Southern Railroad and Norfolk and Western Railroad merged to become the Norfolk Southern Railroad, and this car was then likely used by that railroad, and likely had this number for that railroad as well. Then it was retired and was then moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today, and sometimes it rolls on the village tracks as well. What you see right behind me is Union Tank Line 1328. Union Tank Line 1328 was built by Union Tank Line in 1937 and is a 3-dome tanker car. It was used to haul liquids such as fuel or oil or chemicals many years ago. Also, the car was built to hold a total of 3,380 gallons for a total of 10,140 gallons, and it was once used on freight trains, like it might have been on a mixed freight train and even a line of tanker cars many years ago. Then later on, it was retired and was then acquired by Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today, and sometimes it is seen rolling on the village tracks whenever it is rolling on freight train sets put together as well.
What you see right behind me is Norfolk Southern 133-265.
Norfolk Southern 133-265 was built likely in 1966 and is a hopper car. This car was originally used by the Norfolk and Western Railroad and possibly had this number. This car was used for many years and was used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars and hauled many different types of cargo, such as rocks, coal, gravel, rubble, and many different types of cargo it may have hauled many years ago. Then in 1982, the Southern Railroad and Norfolk and Western Railroad merged to become the Norfolk Southern Railroad, and this car was then likely used by that railroad. It would later find itself in maintenance of way service as well. Then it was retired and was then moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today, and sometimes it rolls on the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is Calumet and Hecla Mining Company 3.
Calumet and Hecla Mining 3 was built by Mason Machine Works in Taunton, Massachusetts in 1873 and is the 5/18th steam locomotive built by that factory and is an 064T Forney six-coupled type steam locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Torch Lake. This kind of steam locomotive is a Mason bogie. It is one of 146 bogie steam locomotives built by the factory, and all were built of various wheel arrangements. It was originally built to run on narrow gauge tracks, which the track gauge was originally 4 feet and 1 inches, and 88 of them built were made to run on narrow gauge tracks, including this one. This locomotive was originally used for the Hecla and Torch Lake Railroad in Calumet, Michigan, and has always had this number. It was built with a diamond smokestack and would later have a straight stack during its mining career. It even had a cowcatcher at some point and would later have footboards. Then later it was transferred to the Calumet and Hecla Consolidated Copper in Amique, Michigan, and again kept the number. It was involved in a Roundhouse fire in 1887 that severely damaged it and several other locomotives owned by the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. It is so amazing that this locomotive survived in one piece after World War II. Then, in 1952, name was changed to Calumet and Hecla Mining and still retained the number. This locomotive was used mostly in the mines in the state of Michigan in the Upper Peninsula during its past life and later was retired. Then, in 1969, it was donated to the Edison Institute in Dearborn, Michigan, and sat on display. Once it got to its new home, it was converted for standard gauge rails. In 1972, the locomotive was restored to operation and it had the honor to pull the first train ride at the village. The next year, it was numbered 100 to celebrate its 100th birthday. It was decorated with banners. It even had its diamond smokestack, which is what it had when it was built. At one point, the locomotive wore the cowcatcher for some years and would eventually wear its footboards again. In 1997, it went under a major overhaul and returned to service in 2002. Today, it can sometimes be seen operating on the Weiser Railroad in Greenfield Village and seen pulling the train very often, and passengers even ride behind it as well. Also today, this locomotive is the last surviving Mason bogie locomotive left in the world today. As well as that, it is the oldest operable steam locomotive in North America as well, and is preserved at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and is often seen pulling the train on the tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake and Ohio 19462.
Chesapeake and Ohio 19462 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1957 and is a boxcar. it hauled cargo that a boxcar like this one once hauled years ago, such as boxes or rolls of paper or any products it may have hauled many years ago, and was used on the railroad on freight trains and even on mixed freight trains and even freight trains with boxcars many years ago. Then it was retired and was then moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today. Also, it sometimes can be seen rolling on the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is New York, New Haven, and Hartford 340-54.
New York, New Haven, and Hartford 340-54 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1957 and is a boxcar. This car was never built for the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. It was built originally for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and was originally numbered 194-64. It hauled cargo that a boxcar like this one once hauled years ago, such as boxes or rolls of paper or any products it may have hauled many years ago, and was used on the railroad on freight trains and even on mixed freight trains and even freight trains with boxcars many years ago. Then it was retired and was then moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today. It was relettered New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad and was numbered 340-54. Also, it is sometimes seen rolling on the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is St. Louis Southwestern 358-50.
St. Louis Southwestern 358-50 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1957 and is a boxcar. This car was never built for the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad. It was built originally for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and was originally numbered 193-85. It hauled cargo that a boxcar like this one once hauled many years ago, such as boxes or rolls of paper or any products it may have hauled many years ago, and was used on the railroad on freight trains and even on mixed freight trains and even freight trains with boxcars many years ago. Then it was retired and was then moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today. It was relettered St. Louis Southwestern Railroad and was numbered 358-50. Also, it is sometimes seen rolling on the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is Canadian Pacific 277-111.
Canadian Pacific 277-111 was built by Canadian Car and Foundry in Kingston, Ontario in 1958 and is a stock car. This car was originally a double-deck stock car. In the 1960s, the railroad rebuilt the car. For many years, this car once hauled animals from farms to whatever destination in the past on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Then later on, it was retired and was then acquired by Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is seen today, and sometimes it rolls on the tracks that go around in the village as well.
Okay, you can see behind me here 3 cars made from scratch, mounted on some freight cars. Those look like flat car bodies underneath, and these are classroom cars, and they can be found here next to the tracks near at West Edge, near the baseball field. And these are where seniors go to finish their year in college at Henry Ford. Well, I hope y'all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. And if you didn't subscribe to my channel yet, the subscribe button is just down below the video screen. If you didn't give my Facebook page a like yet, here's where you can find it. And if you didn't give my Instagram page a follow yet, here's where you can find it as well. Also, be sure to get your merch at teesprings.com. Link is in the description box below, and it's there along with Facebook and Instagram pages. And remember to subscribe to the Train Guy. So this is Matthew Lapp host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show, sign out. Until next time, all aboard!